high, deep in the heart of Texas. The prairie sky is wide and high, deep in the heart of Texas.
All right, A-Push Scholars, Mr. Beamer here. That's Deep in the Heart of Texas from Gene Autry. That's going way back in the 1930s, 1940s, and it relates because we're going to talk about Texas and their independence today. We're going to finish up Chapter 14, 282 to 292, and here are some of the major topics. A lot of it's going to be political, talking about the Whigs, and a couple of elections. Okay, the first section of reading is about Texas. The lone star of Texas flickers, and so a little bit of the background of Texas. Texas originally was a part of Spanish Mexico, but Mexico did get their independence from Spain in 1820. So many Americans start to move into Texas in the early 1820s. In fact, the Mexican government wanted more people in that region because there wasn't many people, and so they encouraged American immigration into Texas, and part of it, they didn't have to pay taxes when they went there. Stephen Austin, maybe you heard the town of Austin is named after him, and he did bring many Americans to Texas. Now, Texas was supposed to be Mexicanized and also become Roman Catholic, but most of the Americans were not that, and they also brought slaves with them into Texas. And so by 1835, there's 30,000 Americans in there, and it becomes a problem for the Mexican government. So continuing with Texas, more and more problems start to arise between Americans and the Mexicans. So the Mexican government actually ended slavery in 1830, but many of the Americans still kept their slaves. And the leader of Mexico was a man named Santa Anna, and he was kind of a ruthless leader, not very fond of him, and he actually raised an army to go against the Americans, and he actually put Stephen Austin in jail for 8 months. So in 1836, the Texans and Americans, the Texans, were unhappy with Santa Anna in Mexico, so they declared their independence. And Sam Houston, another famous name, selected commander-in-chief of the army to go against Mexico. So Santa Anna sends in over 6,000 troops to crush the Texas Rebellion. And the most famous battle about the Texas independence is the Battle of the Alamo that most people have heard of before in present-day San Antonio. And unfortunately for the Texans, it was a 13-day siege, and all 200 Texans were killed. Most famously was probably Davy Crockett was killed at the Alamo. However, shortly after that, Sam Houston does defeat and capture Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto, which is around Houston, and Texas actually does get their independence from Mexico in 1836. And I don't really have a good visual of what Santa Anna looks like, but if I had to take a shot, he'd probably look something like this guy down here. Santa Anna, not good. All right, next section is also about Texas, an international derelict. And so Texas really wanted to become part of the United States because that's where most of the Texans were from America. But our government, the United States government, had to deal carefully with Texas. So President Jackson does recognize Texas independence on his last day of the presidency in 1837. So they are recognized as their own country, free of Mexican rule. Like I mentioned, many Texans did want to join the United States, but the United States was very nervous about accepting them, and they were actually unwilling at first to accept the marriage with Texas into the United States because of slavery. And I would highlight this, because if Texas came in as a slave state, because it did have slaves, then it would upset the sectional balance that was needed in the Senate. So for 9 years, Texas remains outside of the United States, and they were their own country. They were called the Lone Star Republic for 9 years, waiting patiently for 9 years to join the United States, and they eventually do in 1845. And a big reason why they wanted America to join America is because they were afraid that Santa Anna would come back and try to attack them and cause more war. Okay, the rest of the chapter mostly is political issues, and this is such an important group of people we need to know, the Whigs. So the birth of the Whigs and the election of 1836 is the next section. So a new political groups start to develop in the 1830s, and many of the Democratic Republicans became Democrats under the leadership of Andrew Jackson. However, we know Andrew Jackson had many opponents and people against him, and his opponents created the Whig Party. And they hated Andrew Jackson. They accused of Jackson of being a king. Think of the cartoon of King Andrew. And so what is the ideology of this new political party called the Whigs? Well, the biggest thing is they hated Jackson, and that really kept a lot of the different Whig members together. But most of the Whigs did favor the boss in the bank. They were for the American system. Some were for Southern states' rights, but some Whigs actually wanted a stronger federal government, so there was a little bit of conflict within the party. Large northern industrialists and merchants also became a part of the Whigs, especially in the Northeast, and some members of the anti-Masonic party also joined the Whigs, and this party was formed mostly because they did not like Andrew Jackson, who was a Mason. And so here are some of the famous Whig leaders, and we've actually talked and learned about all three of them. The two that you really should know are Henry Clay was probably the biggest Whig, and Daniel Webster. Okay, and John C. Calhoun temporarily was part of the Whigs, but later in the 1840s he's going to break away from the Whig ideology. But he was partially a part of the Whigs, temporarily I should say, because of his dislike for Andrew Jackson. And that is a common characteristic. All three of these guys did not like Andrew Jackson. So the second part of this section is about the election of 1836. So the Whigs, this is the first time they can nominate a presidential candidate, and they choose William Henry Harrison. He was an Indian fighter in the West, especially in Indiana. He was nicknamed Old Tippecanoe for his victory there at the Battle of Tippecanoe against Tecumseh. And the Democrats selected Martin Van Buren. And Martin Van Buren was a very important person. He actually became a founder of the Democratic Party along with Andrew Jackson, and he was Jackson's vice president in his last term. While Van Buren wins the election, it's somewhat close, 170 to 124, so the Democrats remain in power. And so Andrew Jackson, let's talk about his legacy when he left the presidency. Jackson did have some positives. He did bolster the power of the presidency, if that is a positive. He did strengthen the power of the West, so they did have more rights than they had before Jackson's presidency. And of course, the most common thing he's known for is leading the common people. He was a man of the common people and did national politics and did unite the Democratic Party, which is still around today. However, there were many negatives, and there were some big negatives. The spoils system is credited to Jackson in a negative way. So he really starts the spoils system. He kills the bus, which is going to lead to the Panic of 1837. And of course, Indian removal is maybe his biggest criticism for promoting that and taking away lands from Native Americans, especially the Cherokees in the Southeast. Next section, Big Woes for the Little Magician, and that just refers to this guy right here, Martin Van Buren. That was his nickname, the Little Magician. And he had a great political mind. He was the founder of the Democratic Party, but he was not a very good president. And partly it has to do with the events, and unfortunately, he had a very serious event that he had to try to deal with. And unfortunately, he had to follow Andrew Jackson, not because Jackson was a great president, but because of how Jackson left the presidency and the country. And in 1837, we had another panic, a serious panic, worse than the 1819 panic, the Panic of 1837. And really, this was caused by Jackson's economic ideas, by destroying the bus, creating pet banks, and also issuing specie circular, that all this leads to the Panic of 1837. And Van Buren did face criticism from the North over the possible annexation of Texas. So Van Buren did not annex Texas because he did not want to face the criticism from the Northern abolitionists. Okay, Depression, Doldrums, and the independent Treasury. So economic troubles, like I said, do plague Van Buren's presidency. And the Panic of 1837 does happen, and you need to know that it lasted for at least 4 years into the early 1840s. So throughout his presidency, Martin Van Buren had to deal with this panic, and it was caused by over-speculation, especially lands in the West. This is a common cause of many of the panics, and also the wildcat banks in the West that Andrew Jackson created did cause many problems because many of them went under because they lent out too much money. Mentioned earlier that the bank wars or the killing of the bus and the specie circular does hurt the economy in the end, and so the panic happens for 4 years. The Whigs did want the federal government to step in to try to solve some of the problems, but Van Buren said no. Okay, so Van Buren says, I'm not going to do much for the panic. I'll let it try to resolve itself. So Van Buren's response to the economic problems is by passing the divorce bill. I would highlight this. And basically, this bill separated the government from private banking system altogether. So this meant that the bus would not be a part of the federal government. And he decided to pass independent treasury. And I would highlight this. Besides the panic, independent treasury is what Van Buren is known for. And the independent treasury is when the government was going to take their money that they got from tariffs and taxes, and they would take the money and they would store them in vaults in large cities. Thus, the banks would suffer from a lack of government funds. So basically, our government took the money from taxes out of circulation, which hurt the economy even more. Okay, next section is Tippecanoe, William Henry Harrison versus Little Van, Martin Van Buren, and it has to do with the election of 1840. This is a pretty famous election, and it was the same two candidates as in 1836. The Democrats stayed with Van Buren, who was president. The Whigs nominated William Henry Harrison again, and Van Buren had no chance of winning this election because of the Panic of 1837. In fact, the Whigs could have probably elected or nominated Henry Clay, and he would have won. So whoever the Whigs would have nominated in this election would have won because of the Panic of 1837. All right, the Democrats labeled Harrison a poor old farmer, that he was from a log cabin, he lived off a pension, and he had a barrel of hard cider. And this actually backfires against the Democrats. The Whigs actually use this to their advantage, and they make William Henry Harrison out to be a poor farmer from the West. In fact, William Henry Harrison was a wealthy aristocrat. He lived in a 16-room mansion. He had a ton of land, but the Whigs were able to portray him as a poor farmer from the West, and that appealed to the common person. And the Whigs criticized Van Buren as being an aristocrat, drinking champagne, and just not being in touch with the common person. Continuing the log cabin and hard cider. So log cabin again refers to William Henry Harrison being from the West, a poor farmer when in fact he was wealthier, but the Whigs tried to portray him as that, and that he would drink hard cider, which is more of a common person drink, whereas Van Buren might be drinking champagne like a wealthier person. So William Henry Harrison does benefit from this campaign. I would highlight this in the election of 1840. And we talked about Harrison appeared to be more like the common man than Van Buren, and it does help him get elected. John Tyler is going to be important too, because Harrison's going to die within a month or two of being president. So John Tyler was Harrison's vice president, and the slogan, a very famous slogan in American history, in the 1840 election was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Hey, that rhymed. So William Henry Harrison easily defeated Van Buren in this election. It wasn't even close in Electoral College. So he became president. He was fired up, and then he died. This final slide could be the most important slide in this video, and it has to do with comparing Whigs versus the Democrats. So we definitely have a two-party system in the 1830s. The era of good feelings is definitely over by then. It was over in the mid-1820s. But now we clearly have a two-party system, Whigs versus the Democrats. So what did they believe in? The Whigs, like we mentioned earlier, were for the bus, protective tariffs, and internal improvements. These three things are part of the American system associated with Henry Clay. They also wanted harmony of society. They wanted people to behave properly. They did value the community, and so they were not too fond of the poor choices made by the common man. On the flip side, Democrats did want liberty of the individual, and they were more for states' rights. Now, a few Whigs did want a little bit of states' rights, especially this from the South. There were some Southern Whigs, but overall the Democrats were more for states' rights, and they didn't want the federal. There was federal restrictions on social and economic affairs. They tried to guard against the privileged, so the Democrats in general were more against the wealthy, and again, they were more for the common person. But there were some similarities between the two parties. I think this is important to highlight. Both the Whigs and the Democrats were national parties, or catch-all parties. And so the Whigs had support mostly in the North, but there were some Southern Whigs, and the Democrats also, they were mostly from the South, the Democrats, but they did have some support from the North. So the two parties had support all over the country, so they weren't really sectional parties just yet. And there was some social diversity between the two. There were some rich Democrats and some rich Whigs, and some poor Democrats and poor Whigs, so there was some diversity. I would say overall, though, as a rule of thumb, I would say that the Whigs were more for the wealthy. And there was some geographic diversity as well. As I mentioned, both parties had members in the North and South, and it was not very sectional, and that will occur in the 1850s when the Republican Party emerges, especially for their opposition to slavery. By the 1850s, the issue that's going to divide our country, but it's also going to divide the parties. The Whigs are going to split into two, the Democrats are going to split into two, and it's going to be slavery. Slavery is going to become the big issue when we get into the 1850s, which will then lead into the Civil War.